Hello, welcome to the first Ecology Center seminar of 2025. In case there's any new faces here, I'm Peter Adler. I'm a professor in the Wildland Resources Department and the director of the Ecology Center. And I get the honor today of introducing our speaker, Mike Dietze. He grew up in New Jersey. He first realized you could do ecology and get paid for it during a state summer program on the environment. He went to Duke, got a PhD in biology in 2000. He originally was headed towards engineering and then defected to ecology, fortunately. He stayed at Duke for his PhD, which he did with Jim Clark. He worked on forest regeneration dynamics. He finished that in 2006, but there's an important connection between Jim Clark and what Mike's going to talk about today and what he's really devoted his career to in recent decades, a little while, which is ecological forecasting. So Jim Clark was the first author on a paper that came out in Science in 2001, and I think the title was Ecological Forecasting, an Emerging Imperative. And apparently that paper made a big impression on Mike. So here we are today. To finish off his bio after that Duke PhD, he did a postdoc at Harvard, worked with Paul Moorcroft, 2006, 2008. I'm guessing that's where you got even more modeling, the process-based modeling experience with Paul. Started as an assistant professor at the University of Illinois, then moved to BU in 2012. He's been there since. He's now a full professor. Now, if you go by all the typical bean counting metrics that we use to quantify research productivity, Mike checks all the boxes. He's published lots and lots of papers. He's won awards from both the theory and the statistical ecology sections of ESA for best paper of the year. He has lots of grant money from places like NSF and NASA. He's got lots and lots of citations. He's been a Web of Science highly cited researcher. But I don't want to talk about the bean counting stuff as much as the impact that Mike's had on the field. I want to call him even though Jim Clark was the first author on the paper, I would say Mike Dietze is the father of ecological forecasting. And he's done that by investing a lot of time in the kinds of things that the bean counters don't count. So he wrote a textbook called Ecological Forecasting. He founded a community of practice, the Ecological Forecasting Initiative, which has lots of people now, lots of working groups, annual meetings. There's a lot of infrastructure there, a lot of community involvement. So he's really brought lots and lots of people together. He's found really good, talented partners, gotten them to come to some sort of agreement on the vision for this project, and really helped create a new subdiscipline within ecology that I think is still gaining lots and lots of momentum. And I'm very excited about it. I started teaching a class here, a graduate class on ecological forecasting because of all of this. So join me in welcoming Mike Dietze.
Okay, I think that's on. Thanks for that very warm introduction, Peter. And he should not sell himself short, because among the initial cohort of co-conspirators that helped launch FE, he was among our founding committee in the early days when we started getting the ball rolling. Thank you all for having me here. It's really great. I've never been to Logan before, really enjoying the visit. It's also just great to have a place that's still doing in-person seminars. I feel like I've been talking to folks through Zoom all around the country and around the world in the post-COVID era, and it's never as fun as actually coming to meet folks and getting to know folks. So I've really enjoyed chatting with all of you. So yeah, today I want to kind of give my pitch for ecological forecasting. Start my timer to make sure I don't ramble too long. And so basic roadmap for this talk, I want to just define what ecological forecasting is, and then talk a bit about kind of the basic science. What is predictability? How do we measure it? And how does that kind of affect kind of the theory in ecology? Then I want to kind of talk about some case studies. What have we learned along the way? And then I want to end with a bit about building community. Here's the citation that Peter alluded to. And he did get the title and author list right. So to define ecological forecasting, Clark et al. Defined it as the process of predicting the state of ecosystems, ecosystem services, and natural capital with fully specified uncertainties contingent on explicit scenarios for blah, 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 blah. This has been our definition for, gosh, almost 25 years now. Though I also want to highlight a new paper that's not quite out yet. Some great work by Anna Shadeen and Gretchen Stokes, who have actually tried to step back and kind of do a bit of synthesis. So they did a survey of over 100 folks who are active ecological forecasters. They've gone and looked through how terms like prediction and forecast and projection are used in other fields. They've looked at things like use of these terms in Google Trends and actually come up with this updated definition, trying to be consistent with other fields, saying that an ecological forecast is a prediction and its associated uncertainty about an out of sample state of the system. Usually that's time, but that doesn't have to be time. It can be space or other contexts such as phylogeny, made by combining models and data. This slide also highlights that forecasts are often made for many different reasons that are not mutually exclusive. And one of the things I really like about forecasting are the synergies between these goals of things like understanding systems, advancing theory, but also informing decision-making. Indeed, I think ecological forecasting has this really important role to play in informing environmental decision-making because fundamentally, all decisions we make in life are about how we think the future is going to play out. Whether that's, the future of an endangered or threatened species, or what are you going to have for lunch? Everything you do is essentially, what do I think will happen if I do A or B or C? Now, in traditional environmental management, and often even written into our laws for environmental management, not just in the US and around the world, is this concept of stationarity. You manage species to their historical species ranges. You manage ecosystems to flood frequencies or fire return intervals. Those things are changing. And an important thing is to realize that climate change isn't a new normal, that for the rest of our lives, all of us will be living in a disequilibrium state. The new normal is a state of transient change. And if we are in a state where everything is going to be in transient change, you can use historical information to inform your understanding, but you can't use it naively. You can't just say, this is the frequency this happened in the past, so this is how we're going to manage. We need to inform decision-making with an understanding of that change that we're living through. And in that way, I think of ecological forecasts not as the only way to do that, but as definitely as one of the key expressions of quantitatively saying, what do we think is going to happen in this system into the future under current conditions, under different decision alternatives, acknowledging that we are living in a changing world and facing kind of joint climate and biodiversity crises. I also will particularly advocate for a form of forecasting that I call near-term iterative forecasting. And there I define, essentially these two things are somewhat synonymously defined, because I define iterative as basically any forecast done on a time scale where you can meaningfully check how you did, update your understanding, and predict again. In some of our forecasts, that literally is an automated forecast running every single day. That goes up to in time scale to things like some of our forecasts that are informed by forest inventory data that might come in every 5 or 10 years. But the point is we have a system in place where we can meaningfully check if we're doing any good and then update our understanding and predict again. So one of the reasons that I got into iterative forecasting and I think has informed this figure here. So I've done a lot of carbon cycle work. This comes from a survey done by the NASA Carbon Monitoring System for their stakeholders. I do think this picture would be very similar regardless of what natural resource you are interested in. That a lot of the modeling that ecologists have been doing in the last few decades has been motivated by climate change and is often done by projecting things out to 2100 under different climate scenarios. And that's interesting, that's useful. Is it science? Or are you just making a hypothesis about what you're going to happen? Because if you can't test whether that's right or not, you haven't really answered a question, you've posed a question. And I spent decades posing questions about what I think will happen in 2100 that I will never live to check. Important work, but I would argue that there needs to be a balancing of the portfolio across the field to include more forecasts on these shorter timescales, both because this establishes a way we can learn that any field that wants to get good at forecasting gets good at that by setting up a learning loop, a process by where you can test your predictions against new observations and learn. But also, I've never met a land manager that knew what to do with a 2-degree gridded lat-long projection to 2100. You give them that raw output from CMIP, they're just like, what do you want me to do with this? I can't make an operational decision. I make decisions on these time scales and much finer spatial scales. So I really think of ecological forecasting as this opportunity to really meet and respond to this unmet need for information on much shorter time scales, much more local spatial scales, and again, responding to the non-equilibrium nature that climate change isn't something that's happening in the future, that is happening now. And so we need tools like forecasting to help inform adaptation and mitigation. Now, the other thing that I really like about forecasting and this idea of a learning loop is that while it's not the only way of doing science, it is completely compatible with how we think about how the scientific method works. In the scientific method, you start by forming a hypothesis, and in many ways, the models that we use to make forecasts are our embodiment of how we think our systems work. We then use these to make a prediction that we can then test against new observational data. We can then update that understanding and repeat. So this idea of the scientific method and the idea of forecasting, I would argue, are completely compatible. And I would also say that forecasting raises the bar. Because if I'm going to be honest with myself, because I've written lots of these papers too, if I pick up, an issue of ecology or something like that and flip through, you'll see hypothesis statements like, I think X will affect Y. Very specific. If I'm feeling bold, I think X will increase Y. Arguably, we're letting ourselves off the hook fairly easily by making hypothesis statements that are kind of qualitative. Forecasts now force that into specific quantitative predictions that are much more falsifiable. I suspect that if I predict that if I add this much nitrogen, this plant will increase its growth 20%, and if it increases 10%, it increased, but I'm wrong. My understanding needs to be updated to account for new information. And I use the example of nitrogen addition on plants because as a plant ecologist, we've been doing that for decades, if not a century. And yet the null hypothesis is still that nitrogen doesn't affect plants. We have to get, there's a time and place for null hypothesis testing. A lot of the science we do is past that. You know enough about your system to know that's not where you are. Ask more interesting question. Make a more specific prediction. With full disclosure, forecasting teaches humility because you will be wrong most of the time. You will. And that's because forecasts also force us to make our predictions a priori before we see the data and out of sample. If I have a data set, some time series, and I throw my favorite model at it, whether it's a statistical technique or a process-based model or some new fancy machine learning algorithm, I can always make that look really good if you give me enough time. Doesn't mean that I'm going to have any skill at all at predicting tomorrow. That is a test. It forces you to predict out of sample. And we all know that out of sample predictions are great and we should do it, but we don't. Cross-validation is great. It's not the same as truly predicting into the future to a state that you have not seen yet. And forecasting forces you to do that. And I think it will ultimately make for more robust and rigorous science. So this figure kind of just puts these things together and kind of argues that if we have this iterative forecasting cycle where we continually confront models and data and how that intersects with this advancing of science and how this interacts with things like adaptive management and how they are tightly coupled and mutually informative. The other thing that I will say that sometimes happens when I talk about forecasting is folks will say, that's great, but I don't think our models are good enough yet to make forecasts. I've also never had anyone who's posed that be able to tell me when specifically they will be good enough. Because I would argue that a model will never be good enough at making forecasts until you start making forecasts. It is the process of setting up that learning loop, of learning by doing, that is the biggest accelerator of improvement than anything else we've done. This figure shows this increase in skill of the numerical weather forecast. Over time, it's been remarkably constant. If we extend this in the future, it continues to improve. And in this particular version, I have, when various supercomputers came online. You could replace that axis with when various satellites were launched or when various versions of the model were launched, upgraded. None of those explain the increase in skill, which is fairly constant. I would argue that it's the system as a whole, this iterative system, an enviable system in some sense. Since the 1950s, the global weather forecast community has made a prediction of how they think the world works 4 times a day for decades and have gotten a heck of a lot of feedback on what they're doing right and what they're doing wrong. I would argue that that feedback mechanism is why they've continually got better. And this didn't have to happen. If you look at the history of numerical weather forecasting in the early post-war era, when they were doing quite poorly, there was a question on the table. Should we pull the plug, step back and work on improving the models, or should we learn by doing? And there's a lot of evidence that if they had stepped back and tried to improve the models, it would have imploded because it was a lot harder to improve the models than they thought it was going to be. And without that momentum, without that iterative improvement, it would have taken so much longer to get that running. Okay, so that's my initial pitch for why I think forecasting is interesting, important, and why you all should do it. Now I want to talk a little bit about, what does it mean to forecast ecology like we forecast weather? And so to do this, I'm going to start thinking about the concept of predictability. What does it mean for a system to be predictable or not? And I'm going to think about this in terms of this idea of a forecast limit, which is the point in time or space or whatever axis you're trying to make a prediction on, at which you are no longer doing better than chance. Also worth noting that in terms of making forecasts, in many fields, doing better than chance is your threshold for providing useful information to decision makers. The models don't have to be perfect. They just have to do better than chance or better than whatever the current model is. And if there is no current forecast, then it is just better than chance. So what controls how long we have until a model's not doing any better than chance? It really is this growth rate of uncertainty. So you might have some uncertainty for, this might be our nowcast at time 0. How much uncertainty do we have about this current state of the system if we go out and monitor it? We'll then make the assumption that as you go from right now into the future, you will become more uncertain. If you make a forecast and you're more uncertain, if you're more certain about the future than you are about the present, you should stop. Be worried. Don't do that. So we're going to assume that uncertainty increases. And so I would argue that the key thing we need to understand predictability is to understand how quickly that uncertainty increases with time. And that is going to be fundamentally a function of a few things. The initial conditions, this current state of the system, any covariates you're using into your prediction, any parameters in your models, any kind of unexplained heterogeneity or variability in your system, what statisticians call random effects, and kind of any residual process error, the things your model can't explain. Now, from that basic concept, we can do a little bit of math to say that the uncertainty in my prediction of the future state of the system is going to depend on each of those 5 things that I mentioned earlier. But for each of these 5 things, there's a repeating pattern saying that for each of those things, there's the uncertainty about that thing itself, and then our sensitivity to that thing. So take an example from weather forecasting. Weather forecasting is dominated by that first term, initial conditions. And it's dominated by that first term. This is fundamental discovery by Lorenz in the late 50s, early 60s. The atmosphere is chaotic. Atmosphere chaotic mathematically means that first derivative, which in ecology we call stability, like if, we've all done this. Pictures of balls rolling off hills or into valleys, like, I have to do that in any talk, right? So systems that are unstable, this number is bigger than 1. And so you have this feedback. The uncertainty itself times a number bigger than 1 will grow exponentially. That is mathematically why whether the initial, this kind of butterfly effect idea, uncertainties in the current state of the atmosphere grow exponentially and come to dominate any weather forecast. By contrast, it's not a priori clear that that's true for ecological systems. Lots of the systems that we deal with do have stabilizing feedbacks. There are some that don't, that might be dominated by chaos, but there's also many, and this kind of outlines some of the cases that I would say arguably first principles predictions for, when different sources of uncertainty might matter. So I would argue that the relative importance of external drivers, such as our covariates, is going to generally increase importance with time. That's because anything that's a covariate in a model, anything that's a covariate in the forecast, you have to forecast that thing too. And so that thing's uncertainty is going to increase with time, just as your forecast is. That things are going to be predictable either if you have low sensitivity to your external drivers or low uncertainty about them. Low sensitivity are going to be things like, long-lived species that integrate over variability. Things with low uncertainty are systems locked to predictable cycles, systems locked to seasonal cycles, diurnal cycles, tidal cycles. That increases predictability. By contrast, and so this is kind of theory, parameter uncertainty, parameter uncertainty declines asymptotically as you increase more data, but this could be easily dominate data-limited problems. So if you have a new emerging infectious disease, a highly fastly evolving system, a new invasive species, anything chronically characterized by newness, parameter uncertainty is easily going to be a very dominant term in your forecast. Some methodological implications. The value of thinking of, that equation had a whole bunch of d this, d that, sensitivity. Sensitivities are just slopes. ANOVA designs don't tell you about slopes. They don't. They tell you about differences between groups. Regression designs tell you how much something affects something else. All else being equal, even if you never make a forecast, if you collect data or design experiments with a regression design, forecasters could use that to inform how we make predictions. It's very hard to use an ANOVA to calibrate a model. Not impossible. And then this last bit here, you need to accommodate sources of variability heterogeneity, stochasticity, structural error. Even when you can't explain variability, it's useful to accommodate it. And to me, I think there's a big open question about the patterns of predictability across ecology. And to me, on a theory side, this was one of the big motivations beyond kind of the decision side of what got me excited about ecological forecasting is that in addition to having a lot of practical applications, there's this really interesting question. Why are some things more predictable in ecology than others? Are there common patterns? Can I take something that I learned about emerging infectious disease and use it to understand an invasion, or use it to understand an algal bloom or something like that? And which of these factors, evolution, physical environment, interactions, traits, actually explain the variability and predictability? We don't actually know that. I will not answer that question. Give me another few decades. This is going to be a long-term community-wide effort, but I will give some hints later on. And this is just a nod to a nice paper by Abby Lewis, kind of highlighting the theoretical implications, how theory and forecasting should be linked. So now I wanted to kind of use that concept of predictability to dive into some examples of work from my lab. Because kind of starting in 2016, I diversified what we were doing in the lab to make predictions of a whole lot of different things, ultimately to try to inform that question of understanding patterns of predictability. I'm going to focus on 3 different case studies today: our soil microbial forecasts, our phenology forecasts, and our ticks and small mammals, because they give you a nice cross section of what we're doing. And if you want to learn about carbon, which is the thing I spend most of my time on, that's going to be tomorrow's talk. So our soil microbial forecast, this was one that was kind of fun because if you know anything about soils, you would know to expect that you can't predict anything. Soils are notoriously heterogeneous. The classic idea being like, if you take a soil core right here, you take a couple steps over, take another soil core, that you're not going to find completely different things. So we didn't expect much, and so we were pleasantly surprised when we started seeing predictive skill at predicting different soil microbial groups. That we started by doing initially just a spatial forecast, and this was a true forecast. So in this case, we built our models to predict abundance of different groups based on metagenomic data from the temperate and boreal regions across the world, and then we out of sample predicted to the neon sites, which we did not include at all in the calibration. So this was a true out of sample prediction. We did find that predictability increases with spatial scale. That predicting an individual soil core is hard. Predicting a plot is easier. Predicting a site is better. We also found that predictability also increases with phylogenetic scale. It's harder. It's easier to predict a phylum or a class than it is a family or a genus. Functional groups are often easier to predict than taxonomic groups. We also found that methodological details can matter a lot. So here's a great example. Oligotrophic bacteria predicted. So here I report the R squared around the 1-to-1 line versus the R squared around the best fit line, all 0. Because there is a systematic bias between the training data and the truly out of sample collected by different people validation data. Collected by different people means slight differences in lab techniques, slight differences in primer, methodological details, systematic bias between the community data and the neon data, yeah, that's not just the models, that's the methods. After that, we moved on to building true spatiotemporal forecasts. This is the work of Zoe Werbin, who defended in my lab this past summer. This is again driven by metagenomic data, but now we're going to focus just on the neon sites, staying within a single data collected and organized by a single group. Truly the biggest spatiotemporal data set on the soil microbiome that's ever existed. High level, prediction is possible. So this is showing for bacteria and fungi. Bacteria are doing considerably better at overall predictability than fungi, but even fungi are not bad. Also seeing that the effect of seasonality is one of the strongest predictors. I would say before the neon metagenomic data, it wasn't nearly as clear how seasonal microbes actually were because we didn't have that sort of spatial temporal data. So even setting aside the forecast, that was a useful and interesting finding. Similar to the spatial forecasts, there are clear phylogenetic signals, but in this case, I'm going to separate out fungi and bacteria separate out, as well as absolute error versus relative error. So a relative error decreases as you move up phylogenetic, even though the absolute errors increase. But as you aggregate from genus to species family, the absolute abundances also increase, which is why the relative errors can go down. And then we also see that regardless of whether we're looking at relative or absolute errors, that the bacteria are more predictable than the fungi, which is consistent with those earlier predicted observed scatter plots. Another interesting finding of Zoe's that while functional groups tend to be more predictable than taxonomic groups, that the predictability of functional groups depended a lot on what data used to define them. So here, the most predictable groups were the ones that were defined based on experimental evidence, actual direct lab enrichment experiments, literature and literature plus looking at the genomic pathway. So look, for example, like does this organism have genes that are coded that would allow it to do denitrification or nitrogen fixation or something like that? And then this scientific consensus fungal database kind of performed the worst at predictions, but yeah. In terms of forecast horizon, interestingly, we saw that even though bacteria we were more skillful at predicting bacteria, the forecast horizon was actually longer for fungi. We could predict them better than chance longer than we could the bacteria by a few months. In either way, we do see skillful predictions of the microbiome over kind of full seasonal timescales. Not so much on the interannual timescale, but also worth noting that the neon time series are actually very short. These data started in its current standardized format in 2019. We're excluding some of the construction phase data because they use different methodologies that switched things up a bit. Interestingly, we also found that I mentioned earlier that we found clear seasonal cycles in a lot of in both fungal and bacteria. The microbes that varied seasonally in synchrony with the plant's phenology tended to be slightly more predictable on average, and we're all the ones in this longer tail of higher predictability. We're coming from things that had synchrony, and this kind of is consistent with what I was saying earlier. When you have predictable cycles, you tend to have greater predictability. In this case, by the microbes that were linked to the, it's coupled to the plant's cycles. I also should step back and mention that in total, Zoe was forecasting, I think, 276 taxonomic or functional groups across 30-something of the neon sites, holding out a few for validation. So it was something like 90,000 individual time series forecasts. So that allowed us to kind of then ask questions about, when we looked at the forecasts themselves, are there other variables that helped explain the predictability across groups? And so, for example, we found that pH and spatial autocorrelation were kind of the things most associated with predictability. So if we look in this picture here, when it says pH absolute effect, that's not in units of pH, that's the slope. So that's the sensitivity of that species to pH. So basically finding that the more sensitive a species was to pH, the better, more skillful we were at being able to predict it. Similarly, the more spatially autocorrelated a population was, the more in space, the more skillful we were at predicting it in time. And then this PC, that next most important thing was the soil carbon content, and then kind of this longer tail of moisture, leaf area, seasonality, et cetera. Which is kind of fun and exciting because this is, really, I think the first analyses kind of do these comparative analyses of what makes some things predictable or not predictable, as I was alluding to. And the other joke in my lab is that since I was mostly trained as a plant ecologist, most of the lab studies plants. John, who I'll talk about in a second, does our tick and small mammal forecasts, and Zoe was responsible for every other kingdom of life. So we've got them all covered, but it's mostly Zoe. With that, I'll jump to one of our other forecasts. This is Catherine Wheeler, who graduated now 2 years ago, who is working on fall phenology. So particularly so this is a figure coming from Phenocam, kind of showing this kind of average phenological cycle of a deciduous forest. I don't even remember which site this comes in because they all basically look the same. It's not green in the winter. They green up in the spring. Peak greenness is at the start of the season. There's a slow decline in greenness over the season as leaves age, and then a sharp decline during this transition to senescence. And so what Catherine was interested in is looking to see if we could forecast not just when the start of senescence occurred, but how steep that decline was, what that curvature was, and kind of what the full shape of the decline looked like. If you know anything about phenological modeling, you'll know that things like degree day sums have been the traditional approach to phenological modeling, which is great if you're only trying to predict a threshold and if you're trying to predict the spring. In the spring, you have physiological mechanisms that correspond to the sort of things that are expressed in degree days. So you have waxes and resins that to break down to allow buds to burst, and that accumulations of thermal sums are kind of related to that. By contrast, in fall phenology, there's no real physiological equivalent that we are aware of by which plants keep track of degree days physiologically. It's a modeling convenience, but it doesn't correspond to actual biological mechanism. So what Catherine did is instead said, let's think about this differently. Let's use forecasting as an excuse to think about how we think about our system differently. And instead we said, let's think about particularly the senescence, the change in greenness of leaves from green in the summer to colorful in the fall, and model chlorophyll content as a dynamic process involving chlorophyll synthesis, which varies with temperature and day length, in chlorophyll breakdown, which he kind of took as a constant, and build a dynamic process model, very simple. This is like 3-parameter model, 2 covariates, and then try to predict both entire years out of sample, but then also predict parts of the season, and actually found something that I thought was quite remarkable. So basically it worked. It worked, but we'll know. I'll just be honest. The places we tend to mess up are the very end of the season, and that's because this model, which is trying to model chlorophyll content, doesn't capture the process of abscissions, the actual falling of the leaves. It's mostly focused on the changing of the color, which is the earlier season. The other thing you might notice here is I'm coloring the calibration data in black, the validation data in red. These first two here use absolutely no data from the fall to predict the fall. This model is only using the variability in the summer to predict the fall, which has given me a pretty good hint that we might actually be onto something. If we look across sites, another thing we'll note here. So this is showing in the top of the calibration, in the bottom, the validation, how this model performed relative to what we call the historical average, which says if you take all the data at that site and average it over and just calculate the average phenological cycle, what does that look like? And not surprisingly, that's hard to beat in the summer when it's green, and it's really hard to beat in the winter when it's not. So all the action is during this transition phase where we're actually doing better than that historical average. And then that's having trained all of the data, and this kind of colorful picture is looking at how much data did we use for calibration relative to the start of senescence. So all of this is, days that never saw fall. This is days that did. And then, these are the percentage of sites that were able to beat that. So we see that this window here, which kind of focuses on that actual transition point, we can actually start predicting that fairly consistently, even without using any senescence data. If we use the senescence data, we nail it. And then again, that later season error, I think, is more associated with the known lack of fall feedbacks in abscission. But if you do train to the full season, you're doing well across the board. This shows that not only could we predict when the start of spring is, but we could predict the inflection, kind of the amount of curvature, which actually does vary from year to year. Some places in some years have very steep falls, some have very shallow. Yeah, so that was our phenology example. Am I doing on time? Okay, I'm going to pick it up a little bit. Last example from my lab I want to talk about is John Foster's work on forecasting ticks and their small mammal hosts, which are mostly mice. And then, largely because these are species we're focused on as carriers of Lyme and other tick-borne disease. One thing, as I alluded to earlier, anytime you want to predict anything, you need to be able to predict your covariates. So to predict ticks, John had to first build a forecast for mice and small mammals. And these are Green, Henry, and T are three different sites within the Carey Institute in New York, which was the data set we used for training these models. We then built a kind of fairly standard stage structured population model with 3 stages: larvae, nymph, and adult. Nymphs are the ones that are most dangerous because they're tiny, but they've also had one blood wheel, so they have had the chance of catching Lyme. They're also an order of magnitude more abundant than the adults. Not doing great with those 3-stage model. We then switched to a 4-stage model. So we added a dormant life stage as a completely latent process between the larvae and the nymphs. And then we added a model with both mice or weather and mice. So I'm going to focus on this one that has both weather and mice, which was the best performing model. And this is to show, this is a forecast driven by a true out of sample, it was archived, seasonal weather forecast out for a year, showing that it is indeed possible to make skillful predictions of tick abundance a full year in advance, which was awesome. We haven't tested if you can make a prediction more than 1 year in advance because it's hard to get your hands on a weather forecast that goes more than a year in advance. So we don't know. After calibrating the model, we also set this up as an iterative forecast whereby the model was not just updating its states as new data became available, it was also updating the model parameters. So these figures show how the different parameters associated, the different slopes associated with different covariates evolved over time and across sites, showing consistent key drivers of relative humidity and temperature for all life history stages and precipitation for the larvae. Like I said, we have this iterative learning, and then we also did these uncertainty analyses. So we took this model and partitioned it out into these sources of uncertainty I was talking about earlier. Our process uncertainty, our covariate driver uncertainty, our parameter uncertainty, and our initial condition uncertainty. And this is varying seasonal. So these are dates of the year. So this is May, June, July, August, September, October. These were different sampling dates, showing that in this early part of the season, where the total uncertainty is the highest because that's when the ticks are active. This is their dormant season. That the predictability of the tick forecast is largely driven by initial condition uncertainty. We have much more variability in what drives tick populations as they move into the senescent phase and then the dormant phase, and then while they're dormant. And then this is looking at the error in the forecast in both the active season and the dormant season. And the first panel labeled Carey is driven by the historical weather data at the Carey Institute, seeing this increase in skill relative to a similar day of year historical mean, kind of regardless of what we did. But by contrast, when we drive this with an actual archived seasonal weather forecast, NMME is the North American Multi-Model Ensemble forecast, we actually see that the inclusion of mice data was actually much more important to getting predictive skill when we were using the weather forecast, which is what we would actually do operationally, than when we were using the true historical weather. But by contrast, we saw very little gained in forecast skill by actually having data about that early larval stage. Data about the nymphs is what's really important. When I say initial condition uncertainty, that's dominated by the uncertainty of the nymphs itself, which is, again, the high risk stage. We then took these models and moved them across all of the eastern neon sites. I'm just focusing on 4 of those, though the pattern is consistent, which is generally that we learned, the parameters continued to learn as they adapted iteratively to each of these new sites. Also worth noting that the model was built around Oxodes, and so this transferability of the model to Amblyomma, which is an entirely new species, was also successful. Through allowing these models to iteratively learn as they encountered new data. I want to kind of, in the interest of time, kind of skip over a little bit here. Actually, I'm going to tell you about this, but I'm going to skip over some of the results or cover them very quickly. I said that one of the end goals here is to kind of look at patterns of predictability across systems. This was a nice attempt by Abby Lewis and some folks at Virginia Tech to try to do this through a bit of literature synthesis. Doing that is hard work, challenging, and hard to control because lots of people do different things using different approaches. So one of the things that we've done to try to learn more about this patterns of predictability is we launched what's called the Neon Forecasting Challenge. And so this asks folks in the community to provide predictions for neon site level observations before they're collected. So this is a true forecasting challenge. Even neon can't cheat because we're asking you to predict things that data hasn't been collected. We do ask everyone to submit forecasts using a standard format, using standard cyber infrastructure with standard null models. Over the first 4 rounds of this challenge, we've had over 200 teams and 11 courses participate. And we have 5 different forecasting challenges run. So there's one for predicting ticks, an aquatic one for dissolved oxygen water temperature, a phenocam phenology one, a ground beetle biodiversity one, and then a terrestrial carbon flux one. So something for everyone, unless you're in the marine sciences, in which I apologize for the fact that Neon doesn't collect marine data. But, and so we've written a couple papers on the phenology challenge across the board. No matter what approach you use, it's really hard to beat a good null model. But we're seeing very common patterns of how uncertainty increases with lead time in all these systems. And this is similar, the initial results from the aquatic challenge, again, showing fairly consistent patterns, how uncertainty increases with lead time across very different techniques. Okay, so the last thing I want to do before I get booted off the stage is talk a little bit about community building. So as Peter alluded to, we launched the Ecological Forecasting Initiative in 2018 as an attempt to try to build community, to kind of get folks interested in making ecology more predictive science, talking to each other. And kind of before this, I would say very much what I saw was a lot of siloing, like individual labs here or there scattered around the world, interested in prediction without really diving deep into each other's literature to see what each other was doing, or knowing that there was a lot of shared community effort. So one of the things that we've done is we've run a wide range of different workshops and conferences over the years to kind of build community. We've also run sessions at many meetings. Want to highlight in particular, our 2025 meeting is going to be at Virginia Tech this May. Really highlighting that our abstract deadline is actually coming up next week. If you don't have an abstract, you can still register, come and hang out with us. That's open till April. But it's been great building community. We even did our first international meeting this last year, where Finland hosted our first international conference. Effie's done a lot of work in building community across agencies. So we've had a bunch of policy briefs, interagency roundtables, contributed a bunch of reports, also highlighting that the ESA Ecological Forecasting Award, that has a deadline of March 1st. That's coming up too. That's an annual award. But one of the other core things Effie does is we have a series of working groups, and rather than organizing working groups around, animals or carbon or disease, they're organized around cross-cutting challenges. The idea being no matter what you're forecasting, you have questions, you have educational needs, you have theory questions, you have methodological questions, you have decision support questions. And so FE working groups are often very interdisciplinary and bring folks together from very different subdisciplines to talk about shared challenges. The other thing we've been doing in the last few years is launching international chapters. So we've got a Canadian, Oceania, and European chapters that are very active, an African chapter that we're in the process of building. We've developed community standards. In the interest of time, I won't talk about them in detail other than to say these are the sorts of things that make these sorts of forecasting challenges possible. These are sorts of things that make building shared tools and infrastructure possible, then therefore make scaling up these efforts more easy. We've done a lot of work on education and diversity, running summer courses, building reading groups, building materials. We've been running for a number of years now, environmental data science mentoring and training program across a number of tribal colleges. And I'll wrap up there and just say, if you're interested in FE, you can learn more at our website. You get a free mug if you join. You can sign up for community Slack. There's something like 700-800 people on this community Slack. Monthly newsletter. I think one's going out tomorrow. That goes out to like 3,000 people, and a whole bunch of other cool stuff going on. Particularly really want to highlight one of our most successful things. We've been doing a methods webinar every month jointly with the Ecological Society's Statistical Ecology section. And everything we've done in the past is up on YouTube. Like we had a couple of webinars where like 800-900 people actually showed up, like to learn about GAMs from the guys that made GAMs, stuff like that. It's a wide range of different topics, regardless, if there's animal movement stuff and species distribution stuff. It's a wide range of different things. Anyway, I will stop rambling. Thank you for hearing me out, and I'm happy to take any questions.
You have to run, don't, because we're going to serve food out in the atrium right after this. Stick around for that. Mike, if you would repeat questions so that the people on Zoom can hear through microphone.
Sure.
That'd be great.
Yep.
So, awesome talk. I know that one of the kind of big debates in forecasting is this idea between producing like phenomenological models where you're just like looking at associations over time without looking at mechanisms, and these mechanistic models where you're trying to derive mechanisms that influence the systems you're not predicting.
Yep.
I guess from experience and from your own, work on this topic, why and when should we invest time into understanding mechanisms for predictions?
Okay, so the question was about kind of the trade-offs between phenomenological models and more mechanistic models, and the value of when you should take the time in investing in mechanistic models. So I would say a couple of things. One is that even the most diehard fan of machine learning that I have encountered in the ecological forecasting community gets really nervous the farther you go out into the future and the more out of sample the conditions are. You know, the more phenomenological an approach, the worse it gets in new and novel conditions, the more risk it's just going to go completely crazy. So that I would say is a key take home. Anytime your predictions are into novel environments, there's a value of mechanism. I use mechanistic models predominantly, but I will also say where I see one of the most exciting frontiers in forecasting across the Earth system sciences, not just in ecology, and I'll talk about this a little bit more tomorrow, and is what we would call hybrid approaches. Approaches that take a dynamical model or process-based model as their core, but in various flavors this can be done, combine that with some of the strengths of machine learning and the idea of trying to get the best of both worlds, to try to get the process understanding and mechanistic representation that is provided by mechanistic models, but account for the fact that you can never put all the mechanisms in a mechanistic model. You don't always know all of them. So you use flexible techniques to try to basically understand the patterns of the errors of your model and combine them. And if you look at literature, for example, in numerical weather forecasting, you will see a lot of recent papers where these sorts of hybrid approaches have been able to outperform traditional numerical weather forecasting models. Now, part of that is because they were trained on, reanalyses, which were the hybrid of data and models themselves, essentially saying the machine learning models were able to learn something that is embedded in that reanalysis that the process models never did. I think, we had a Gordon conference a couple years ago on predictive ecology, and I would say in that meeting and our meeting this year, I would say that's definitely something I'm seeing in the ecological forecasting community, though not universal. There's actually been some interesting case studies where some of these hybrid approaches haven't outperformed the process models, which is itself interesting. I guess the other advantage is that process-based models take a lot, machine learning models take a lot of data to train. And so the other thing that hybrid approaches do is to let you use much smaller sample sizes of real data because you're leveraging the dynamic model, the process model. Yep.
Love your work. Thanks for the talk. So I'm interested in your, like you started with that focus on the week to year forecasting that we're lacking. I think I systems, I work in sagebrush systems like this or Savannah's, and it's a slow moving ship. Like I can tell you exactly what the sagebrush meeting is going to look like in the next 6 months or 9 months or a year or 2 years. That's not really of interest because we're looking along that species. We want to know where these transitions might occur, where you really get big shifts, but nobody expects them to happen for 5 or 10 years out. And so,
yep.
Yeah.
So I think the question was kind of about, the value of ecological forecasts and systems that are slower moving, and where any of us can predict tomorrow fairly naively because it's going to be the same as today. Yep. And I guess I would say that one of the things I said earlier was I don't want to say that longer term forecasts under climate scenarios are not of value. I was more arguing that there needs to be a more balanced portfolio that I think in some sense we tried to run before we learned how to walk. We tried to make predictions at centennial timescales before we learned if we were any good at predicting predictions at decadal and subdecadal timescales. You don't get to learn from making predictions to 2100. You get to learn by making predictions on timescales that you can actually check if you're right or not. And maybe that is a decade or two, and you're willing to wait around to see if your predictions are any good or not. But I would argue you only learn things as new data comes in iteratively. I would also say that there are examples of what we would think of as long memory systems where forecasting is useful. I would say, for example, that one of the key ways that the voluntary carbon markets work for nature-based climate solutions, particularly for soil carbon, which is much slower than above ground biomass, is essentially a forecasting process. You use models to make predictions of how soil carbon will change over just the next 5 years under a status quo versus different management options. Nothing crazy, will going from till to no-till increase soil carbon? Will adding manure increase carbon? Yeah, probably. What matters is how much, because that's how many credits you get to issue. And interestingly, if you know about how these markets work, there is an uncertainty penalty in them. Basically, you have to pay a tax on the credits you can issue based on how uncertain your prediction is. If your prediction in the validation data, if you don't have 90% coverage on your 90% coverage interval, you get to issue 0 credits by being falsely overconfident. So you want to be as tight as possible without being overconfident. So I mean, that's an example where I would say there's a whole lot of real world money being put into trying to predict what we think of as a fairly slow process over time scale, over just a 5-year time scale. So I think there is value. Well, if there's no more questions, I'm happy to. Oh, no, Peter. Okay. Okay. I'll no longer stand between you and food.